My name is Austin Dressman, and I'm the Community and Events Manager here at Engaging Networks. And yeah, before I jump into the actual session here, give the reins over to our friends here, I want to give them a brief introduction. First, I'm going to go with Beth. Beth Dahlman is Senior Vice President at M&R and has over 16 years of experience leading digital strategy that moves people and raises money. She's helped big and small organizations like the International Rescue Committee, March of Dimes, Fos Feminista, and several regional food banks pilot new strategies, win policy victories, recruit supporters, retain donors, all kinds of really important, significant, amazing things for these organizations. And Beth is based in St. Paul, Minnesota. And then Henry is vice president also at M&R and is an experienced digital strategist and leader in the nonprofit and political sectors. In addition to his digital fundraising and advocacy work at M&R, he served with some really great organizations. We were just talking about digital fundraising director at Innocence Project, deputy director for digital strategy and grassroots giving at the Clinton Foundation, senior email strategist at Biden for President, and a lot of other great things he's been involved with. And he's also worked with organizations like ASPCA, Oceana, Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, and Henry's based in Morris Plains, New Jersey. So that's a little introduction here for both of our speakers. I want to hand things off to Beth and Henry. Thank you both for being here. We're really excited.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. So happy to be with you all here today. We'll start off with just a quick, you heard about us as individuals, quickly introduce M&R. We're a consulting firm and we work exclusively with nonprofits and foundations whose missions that we believe in. And we provide a pretty wide range of services to support clients in their messaging, fundraising, policy, and political change goals. One thing that we are really known for around the industry is benchmarks. You can see on the next slide. This is our annual study that compiles data from a bunch of nonprofits, sort of goes beyond our individual client base to get a really good view into the sector as a whole. One thing that I really like about benchmarks is every year there is a theme, and I feel like our creative team they outdo themselves every year. This year's the theme was board games. So you'll catch a bunch of, little puns and board game references in the study. The full study is available online at mrbenchmarks.com if you want to check it out. Also, if you want to get on the list to participate next year, we're always hoping to have as broad participation as possible so that the study is as robust and useful as it can be. And we're going to start off this webinar with some context and data from this year's study. So first of all, just thinking about, what are the big takeaways from benchmarks as a whole? I could easily spend several hours just going through all the data, but at the very, very big picture, what we found this year was digital fundraising was basically flat. Then as we look at some of our messaging and advertising data, we saw that lists were growing, but a lot of the performance of the individual messages was starting to drop. Also, ad spend is increasing. So all of these things sort of totaled up together. In 2023, nonprofits were really working a lot harder to basically maintain or sort of see the same results. It's getting to be a lot more crowded, a lot more expensive in the advertising space. And a little bit, unfortunately, that's something that we anticipate is going to continue, particularly during the peak of election season. As we're looking at very specific benchmarks, I just wanted to highlight some of the data relating to messaging and then a little bit on advertising, thinking that that's probably going to be most relevance to the folks on this call thinking about their, particular election strategies. So this is email messaging rates. We've got click-through rate, page completion rate, response rate, and unsubscribe rate broken down by the type of message that it is. And as you can see here, as I was mentioning, nearly every benchmark for email messaging rates went down for 2023 compared to 2022. So, lists are growing. Getting more people on your file tends to be the thing that is leading to, any increases in email-driven revenue or actions, but we're sort of getting getting less juice from every single squeeze of those email messages. So that's the context that we're heading into as we continue with the rest of election season. Mobile messaging, this is definitely something that is, I know newer for the nonprofit space, particularly compared to email. We don't have click-through data sort of from enough providers to have a good benchmark there. So this is mobile revenue per 1,000 fundraising messages sent. And this is just something to sort of keep an eye on, how much are you getting from every single text that you're sending out compared to some other types of organizations. As you can see, this varies pretty wildly based on sector. So really thinking about sort of how you position yourself within other organizations is a good thing to keep in mind as you're wondering about your own mobile performance. Digital advertising. So this is looking at ROAS, or return on ad spend. Essentially, for as much as you pay the platform to show your ad, how much are you getting back immediately? $1 and above is breaking even or sort of immediately making a profit. So calendar year 2023 data that we're showing here. And I would expect these sort of returns as we're seeing higher competition with, electoral advertisers, more demand for that space and attention from different supporters, that these returns will probably go down. We'll likely to continue to see a lot of variation between different platforms, also depending on the goal you have in mind to show your ad, but just like something to keep an eye on for your individual results as you're moving through the year. And then I know sort of adding to that pool of supporters, folks that you have an email address and you're able to communicate with. These are the cost to get someone to sign up for your emails if you're doing that in a paid space. Again, we see a lot of big variation depending on sector, but overall, that was about a $3.33 cost to get that new name on your list. And again, this is something that I would anticipate to see these costs rising a bit as competition gets a little more stark. All right. And then just before we get into some election specific considerations, the perennial reminder that the most important benchmark is your own. So certainly we think the study is really helpful to put your results in context with the rest of the industry. But as we're looking through, the changes in the news cycle, changes in, what your supporters are hearing about, thinking and feeling, tracking your own data and looking to any of those changes and responding accordingly is really sort of the most important thing to keep in mind as we're navigating these tumultuous times.
Tumultuous times they are. And I know everybody is here thinking about how to prepare for peak election season. I think we're not quite at the peak yet, but clearly there's already a lot going on and a lot that folks can be preparing for. I think something that is unique about presidential campaigns compared to some other events that we tend to key messaging around is that they're just loaded with big predictable moments that are going to happen and should be good anchors for your fundraising, advocacy, and engaging messaging. And you can prepare a lot in advance because you basically know what the story for a lot of these big moments are going to be. The candidates will debate. One will probably have positions on your issues that you agree with more. The conventions are going to happen. The candidates are going to restate their platforms in a big public forum that people are paying attention to. Big scary poll results are going to come out, and you can tell the story that you want about them, whether that's everything is great or for our fundraising purposes, much more likely we're all doomed. And voting is going to happen. What dates voting begins and how you can message around that. So it gives you a good opportunity to think in advance about how you're going to respond to them and ideally prep those responses in advance as much as possible. And so here's a good example from one organization that did this in the last campaign, United We Dream Action Pack. This email launched right after the last presidential debate ended, like within, I think, an hour. It feels very breaking news-ish, although I don't think that it actually was. I don't work with this organization, so I can't speak directly to their strategy, but I'm guessing that they likely pre-drafted the majority of this message and then just updated the lead with this specific line about Trump lying about child separation to make it feel like it was breaking rapid response, and then they could get out to their list while folks who had watched the debate were still thinking about it. It still felt fresh and they were still motivated to give. Similarly, with this example from the NRDC Action Fund, you can see they updated their lead of the email with a direct quote from President Biden. But then after that, I think everything else is evergreen content about their approach to making a plan to vote, signing up to get a mail-in ballot, all stuff that could have been pre-drafted, pre-prepared, but still allowed them to participate in election messaging in a way that felt fresh and relevant and timely. But all that said, we all know that campaigns are full of moments that can't actually be predicted in advance. As Austin mentioned, I worked on the Biden for President campaign in 2020. And when I think back to that experience, there were moments like when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, or when President Trump was checked into Walter Reed with COVID. For a brief moment, it appeared his life may be in jeopardy. Those screeched everything that we were doing to a total halt, and we had to pivot on a dime. We all saw this happen last weekend, again in real time, with the attempt on Donald Trump's life. And I think it really pays dividends to think about these moments and plan for them as much as you can. Do you know what your organization is going to do if there's another Supreme Court vacancy during this campaign, or if there are other instances of January 6th style political violence, or even, something lower stakes where just an unplanned moment where Trump or Biden says something about your organization's issue and suddenly it's in the headlines. You should really be thinking about how to respond. So let's talk about how you can actually do that. What to do when things go sideways. I think the first piece of advice that I would have is really do some scenario planning. Consider creating an if this then that grid that maps out some of the potential possibilities related to your key issues and how you'll respond if they come up. So if you're an international aid organization, what happens if one of the countries where you do programmatic work suddenly takes center stage? What does your response look like? Is there any talking points or other things that you can pre-plan to make sure that you're ready to take advantage of that moment in time if it comes up? To that point, I think having a rapid response process is incredibly important. You don't want to be like the dog in the GIF when November happens and suddenly you're being asked to respond to events in real time. Think about what content you can draft and get pre-approved for things that are likely to come up in a campaign context. And for the rest, the things that are truly last minute work, is it possible to cut down on your usual review and approval chain to just the people, 2 or 3 folks who really need to see a message before it goes out? To make sure that those reviewers are integrated in your process and that you're not taking big unnecessary risks with your communication strategy, but also streamline as much as possible, pre-do as much of the work as possible, and make sure that people understand what the plan in place actually is. And then my last big piece of advice would be to really think holistically about your approach to unexpected campaign news. Do you really need to be the people responding to a news story? To use the example of the Trump shooting, it's something that obviously could impact all of our organizations and those organizations' supporters. But how many of us actually have something really unique to say about it that our audiences really need to hear right this second from us? So use some restraint, make sure that you are not getting ahead of your skis and sharing misinformation or just messaging that's not helpful to the way that your supporters think about your organization and their relationship with it. So here's another example of an organization doing a good job with campaign-related messaging, in this case, particularly on something unexpected. Planned Parenthood Action Fund was out with this heartfelt tribute to Justice Ginsburg just a few hours after her passing on the night that she died. I like this email a lot because, there's no hard ask here. It's not an attempt to steal the moment or refocus it on the organization and their needs, but it still makes Planned Parenthood Action Fund a part of the way that its supporters processed this moment and spoke to their feelings authentically. Another example of just harnessing a relevant issue by an organization is this ad from Feeding America. They had all sorts of messaging along this line, but taking a real world event that is affecting the election, in this case, the pandemic, and tying it back to one of their core issues in a way that feels authentic and kind of clears that bar of why is this organization that I support financially getting involved in this issue and talking about the news. Whereas on the flip side, here's an example of the wrong way to respond to a big news story. It's not a nonprofit, but a brand. But I can promise you that there were just 0 people in the world wondering what Pepsi was thinking about the protests that were gripping the nation in 2020. And yet they still went out with this big commercial where Kendall Jenner ended police brutality with a soft drink. And like, it's just not speaking to anyone's thoughts or feelings or needs in that moment. So this is kind of what I meant when I say, like, do you really need to be the one speaking up right now? Think really critically about how your donors and your supporters are going to see your response if you feel like you want to get involved in the big news story that is dominating attention when it comes to the election.
All right. Yeah. And speaking of attention on the election cycles are long. I know Henry mentioned we're not quite in peak election cycle yet, though I know for a lot of us, it feels like we've been there for many, many years. So how do you hold on to people's attention sort of through all these ups and downs? First, asking your supporters, doing some surveying. This will also sort of help you stay in tune with what folks are thinking and feeling if you're trying to weigh, is this like a potential Pepsi moment or is this a potential Planned Parenthood after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death moment? Understanding sort of what is most important to folks and keeping an eye on it. You can send these out as a one-off message. We'll have an example a little bit later that sort of shows integrating it into other comms. Another good thing to do, especially if you have a larger file, is you can automate a survey and send it to a portion of your list sort of over the course of the year. And then you can track any changes in your supporter sentiment over time and have a sense of, how are folks reacting to the news? How are they reacting to any proactive messaging that you are putting out there? Speaking of automations, when we know that the external news environment is going to be really crowded and you might need to be really thoughtful about your messaging and careful about what do you want to say, when, and to who, taking advantage of automations in places that they have what I like to call as like personal relevance. So here's a membership lapsed automation example. This is something that is very relevant to this individual person who has that renewal date. That can help save some brain space and some calendar space to take on those individualized messages in a more kind of set it and not quite forget it, but maybe don't think about it every day approach. And then use the rest of your calendar for more sort of timely and rapid response messaging. And then one little note on automations, of course, always have a list of what you're running and what the content is. So if something does change and you need to pause or update your messaging, that is something that you can have listed in your rapid response protocol and be ready to shift. So you're not going out there with a mismatch in terms of, appropriate messaging should something change. The other thing that is really important for keeping supporters engaged over the long haul is showing impact, especially for longer term campaigns for organizations that are going to be here after the election. And we hope to sort of keep our supporters with us for the long term. If you're constantly talking about, crisis or something that is really high stakes, but not showing your supporters how engaging with you is going to help solve that problem, like that's not very inspiring or motivating. Eventually, people are going to get burned out and start tuning you out. So making sure that you are layering in, here's how we're making a difference, here's how engaging with us helps us achieve our goals is really important for that longer term engagement. We actually have some test results from a client that tested some impact focused language versus emotional stakes language and found that the impact message won and improved some fundraising results. So this message from 350 is a great example of some, really robust impact reporting. It also incorporates a little bit of like surveying and audience temperature taking in it at the same time. So it's a little kind of a combo message. But incorporating this showing impact doesn't have to be just these kind of dedicated messages. You can weave a line or two into your other communications, into a fundraising appeal, into an advocacy message, just making sure that you're showing your supporters that how they are engaging with you is going to make a difference. And then last, thinking about giving people a variety of meaningful actions they can take over the course of, the year, over the course of a long election cycle. Focus and repetition are definitely very good things that many of us don't do enough, but also thinking about your supporters are in a lot of different places, and the actions that they might be ready to take this day or this moment are probably going to be a little bit different. So having different types of options for people to participate, volunteering, to, sharing your message, to, emailing their elected officials, etc. Not every supporter is going to be up for every action at every time. So if you give a wide variety of things for folks to do, means more of your supporters are more likely to find something that's going to be a good fit for them. And then next, wanted to chat a little bit, we've been talking a lot about what might make sense for organizations that are pretty directly engaged in the election. Maybe you're doing voter turnout, or maybe you have a really robust policy or advocacy approach. It's also going to be important, even if you're not directly engaged with electoral politics, whatever happens in the lead up to November and in the election itself will probably impact your organization, because your supporters are likely paying attention. And then there's policy implications that can really impact the causes that we work on. So a few things to keep in mind, sort of regardless of if you're directly engaging or sort of indirectly engaging. First is there's going to be a lot of competition for attention. SMS and email inboxes are going to get even more crowded, and advertising inventory is going to be scarcer and more expensive. Sort of eyeballs and attention is what everyone is going for. So just making sure that you're including that context as you're planning your communication strategies and especially your media spends. Thinking about advertising buys in particular, there's a couple particular logistics to keep in mind. If you have any planned ad spend for platforms that have like a hard limited inventory, such as podcast ads, out of home ads where there's a particular spot that you're showing your ad, make sure to reserve that as far in advance as possible so you don't get sort of bought out by other folks who are going for the same audience as you are. We are also thinking about platforms. They seem to change their rules about political advertising, who they consider to be a political advertiser with every election cycle. Right now, we are anticipating similar restrictions from Meta as the 2022 cycle, but that could change. So make sure to keep an eye on those updates and news announcements as they get rolled out. See if there's any kind of special certifications your organization might need to go through in order to keep ads live during some of these key times. You might be surprised at what is considered political content. Often the platforms have a much broader definition of that than we might, and certainly than, like, say, the IRS does. And it's also another reminder not to put all your eggs in one basket. It helps to have a fairly diversified media plan so that if you start, suddenly you are dark on Meta because they've decided that you're political and they are cutting off political advertising. Being already set up in a few other platforms will help protect you against any of those potential curveballs and be ready to keep showing your message to supporters. And then another thing is just to make sure to keep the authenticity and relevance in your messaging. So really thinking about what is the thing that only we can say. Causes and brands, if your Sesame Workshop can help provide connection and meaning during chaotic times. So even if you're not directly talking about what's going on with candidates or policy issues, reminding supporters of why they are engaged with your organization, what kind of values do you have in common, and showing that back to people and giving them an opportunity to connect can be something that people crave, especially when the outside world might feel a little chaotic. So show supporters what makes you unique. This example from Sesame Workshop was an email that they sent out over, they had a sort of viral tweet from Elmo asking how everyone was doing. And then a lot of people wrote back and were like, not great, Elmo. And so they were able to take that moment as sort of like what became a little internet meme and highlight the work that they do to support, children and families' emotional and mental health needs. So stuff like that, it doesn't necessarily have to be directly related to the headlines you see, but showing people, why did they sign up to be a part of your organization in the first place? What is meaningful? What are you doing together? Just remembering to highlight what makes you special and unique.
All right, so I know it does not feel like it, but the election is coming. It will eventually happen and it will be over, and we will all still be here and have to think about what comes next. So, the first thing that I want everyone to consider is just that different election scenarios could have really significantly different revenue implications for your organization. Looking back at previous M&R benchmark studies, we saw that in 2017, after President Trump's first election, a lot of organizations saw a big increase in fundraising as a direct result of that. Not so much with President Biden's election. There are a lot of other factors aside from the presidential race that go into those numbers. But my point is that you may see a big Trump bump in next year, but I wouldn't count on it. It's just a very different news cycle, different electoral context, and I think it's worth putting some real thought into how different post-election revenue scenarios could impact both your 2024 results and also your planning for 2025. And then again, underscoring some of what we talked about before from just a comms and rapid response and expecting the unexpected scenario. This is obviously a very charged political moment in American history, and things could get weird after Election Day. They could get scary. And I think it is going to be worth the time to coordinate upfront with folks in your communications teams, folks in your leadership, really do that scenario planning, game out what could happen and how your organization is going to respond, both in a supporter-facing way and in an internal organizational way, to make sure that you're prepared for what can happen, and to the degree possible, you are managing the various scenarios and mitigating risk to your organization and just setting yourselves up for success as this election season mercifully eventually comes to an end. And I believe that is it for our planned content. So I think we can move into questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. So I'll encourage anybody, if you have some questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A section there. We do have a couple of questions that came before the webinar here that folks had mentioned they want us to ask. So kind of tying this to what you already shared, you spoke a lot about how email performance is kind of overall kind of trending down a bit, and there's a variety of factors for that, I know, but is there, or maybe there's a sense of election fatigue or something on that front, but how can organizations kind of make their email stand out and in spite of that happening? Have you seen things that are kind of working, things that aren't working?
I can go first, and then Henry, if you want to chime in later. I mean, I would say things that are working tend to be the things that have always worked, but in a slightly kind of more concentrated fashion. For fundraising, we've seen a lot of organizations have success with, like, say, like a dedicated giving day. And while obviously, those are not something that you can like pull off tomorrow, but really emphasizing like the urgency, timeliness, sort of creating a like, here's a thing we're all going to do together. That is certainly something that is continuing to work. I I would say things change pretty rapidly. So like the trendy, subject line style or like call out box format that might be working right now can sort of go out of fashion fairly quickly as people might get used to it. It's sort of no longer as novel or attention grabbing. So continuing to test whether you're doing a formal A/B test or just piloting a bunch of things and seeing how your supporters respond would be sort of the main advice I would give there, as well as turning to some of those principles that we know always work to help drive like response and engagement. So, urgency, authenticity, relevance, showing a clear need, and then showing how your organization is going to help meet that need. Really sort of distilling things down to those core principles and making sure that you can kind of check as many of those boxes as possible. And then thinking about, as Henry was mentioning in the beginning of his presentation, like, is this something that I really need to be talking about? like, just being as true as possible to your organization's voice and what your supporters are eager to hear from you.
Yeah, I think that's all right on, Beth. And the only thing that I would add, really, to underscore one of the points that you made, is that every email list is different. Every organization's supporters are different, and what works for one organization doesn't necessarily work for another one. So I really do think at all times, but especially during times like this where there's heightened competition for email attention and results, it's really important to have a testing plan. Think about what your KPIs that you want to impact are. Where is your program seeing areas of opportunity? And what are some different things that you can test out to see if it works for your group of supporters specifically? Always be iterating and optimizing as much as you can just to find the right blend that is going to stick out for you. But overall, I think email is a challenging space. It is getting more and more challenging over time. And in addition to doing all of these things to improve your email performance, I would also really encourage organizations to think creatively about their channel mix and understand that you're probably not ever going to get email response at the same level that you did several years ago. It's not to say that email is dead or going away, but it's more important than ever to also, be up on paid media, be using new channels or newer channels like SMS, and just reaching out to supporters where they are, because they're not in their inbox in the same way that they might have been 5 or 10 years ago.
There's some really great points in there. I appreciate that. And I just selfishly need to ask, are emojis still a thing in subject lines? Can I still use emojis?
I mean, I
right
will
direction?
always, as an elder millennial, you will never get me to stop using emojis.
Yeah.
So, I feel like they've been, definitely working. I think it's sort of, like many things, like use them. It's like salt or whatever, right? Like you want to sprinkle them in for a little extra boost, but probably not all the time in every message. But yeah, definitely something that still works well, I think.
Okay, perfect. I was not emotionally prepared if you were going to tell me I shouldn't. So thank you.
I would never.
Thanks. Okay, we got a couple other questions that came in here. Drew is asking, do you have any recommendations for promoting voter registration efforts, particularly for something like National Voter Registration Day, September 17th?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of things you can do. I would say at a very sort of basic level, it'd be thinking about, like, are you trying to mobilize the supporters that you already have in your orbit, or are you looking to kind of go and find some new people that you might already be not talking to, and motivate them to register and hopefully turn out to vote too? So strategies would differ like slightly depending on which of those audiences is more important, but certainly, email and SMS promotions, letting people know this day is coming up, making sure, depending on where you're geographically based and, knowing all the different deadlines that might be relevant to your audience. Then, sort of very basic, like advertising strategies can work well. Social ads we've seen be pretty effective for, driving voter registration and things like that. With the caveat that all things Meta have been fairly volatile in the past couple years, but those are kind of the places I would start, of sort of like looking to engage as much as possible with your own channels like email and SMS. And then if you're looking to reach some new folks, maybe starting on, social ads and then expanding from there depending on your budget and what kind of folks you're looking to reach.
Yeah, the one other thing that I would add is there are a lot of tools out there. I know vote.org has one, but I think there are several other alternatives that will allow you to embed a "Are you registered to vote?" form right on your website. Getting up a page like that can be really valuable for speaking to your own supporters and making sure that they are registered in advance of their local deadlines to do so. They are presumably on your email list, your SMS list, or your social channels because they trust you as a institution and a messenger that shares accurate election information. So putting that form under your own banner on your own website can help them have confidence that the information that they're seeing is legitimate and that the next steps that you're guiding them towards in terms of how to register if they're not, or how to help friends or family members who might not be registered to do so, are going to be legitimate.
Perfect. Thanks for that. A lot of great resources there that people can tap into. I have another question here related to the election. It says there's a lot of fear in some organizations about electioneering. What advice would you give on creating relevant content during an election cycle for a cautious organization?
So I would start by just emphasizing that I'm not a lawyer. To the best of my knowledge, Beth is not as well. So I think this would be a good one to take up, certainly with your legal teams, to make sure that you're in compliance with the nuanced and strict guidelines over what constitutes electioneering and what doesn't. I think, generally speaking, a safe approach is to stick to your issues and how the issues the organization works on are being impacted by things that are happening in the election. Avoid talking about supporting one candidate over another. It is, broadly speaking, safe to ask people to pledge to vote to take on Hunger in America, to harken back to the Feeding America examples that we shared earlier. It is going to be dicier water to say Joe Biden has a better plan to end hunger than Donald Trump, and you should vote for Joe Biden. So my general guideline would be keep it to the issues and how what your organization does is relevant in the context of the election conversation. And if you're skirting into any talk of the specific candidates or specific races, that would be a good one to consult an expert about.
Perfect. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. This one also kind of pointed to you, Henry. It says a question on one of your final points about preparing for the day after the election, apart from revenue implications brought on by months of intense competition from candidates and other orgs there. Can you walk us through an informal checklist of concerns that maybe everyone should be kind of keeping in mind?
Yeah, it's a good question, Peter. And I think it is to some degree hard to anticipate because it dips back into that question of like, how do you expect the unexpected? Some things that I would be encouraging organizations that I work with to think about are what happens if the election is not over on election day and we're in a scenario like we were last year where things are stretching on for weeks to months after the votes are cast. Are you planning to continue messaging with your election, messaging that you were going to before, or pivoting to talking about something else in the event that major election news is stepping on your Giving Tuesday or calendar year end plans that are important to your ability to hit your 2024 revenue goals? Are you coming up with some messaging contingencies to address things that are happening now in the news in that messaging to make sure it feels relevant and authentic, and that you're not going with like a very institutional, like Giving Tuesday togetherness message on the day where there's an act of political violence, to use a horrible example? And then similar to just the overall scenario planning, like what are the issues the organization works on? How is it possible that they could be impacted by the election results one way or another? Have you thought through what messaging around that looks like and how you can get that reviewed, approved, and ready to go or adapt and go as quickly as possible in the event that you need to do so.
It's a lot to think about. Sorry.
One quick thing I'd add to that, is also in terms of, especially if it is like a, ambiguous outcome, if there's a lot of sort of like, litigation, ongoing confusion, the point about, being really thoughtful about your messaging, taking extra care not to share any like misinformation, just adding those added layers so your organization isn't contributing to any of the chaos or uncertainty, to sort of, you can kind of help be calm for your supporters and, point a spotlight on, the things that we do know, the things that we're still waiting to find out. So just being extra cautious there, even if it feels, extra urgent, that's sometimes the time where you need to just take that extra moment of pause even more, so that you're not inadvertently sort of adding to a more difficult situation.
It's really helpful. So much stuff to think about when it comes to the outcomes and the current state of things and everything like that. I want to actually touch on that with one other question here. And feel free, anybody else, if you have any last questions you want to drop in there, go for it. But otherwise, we'll kind of keep this as our last discussion point. But there have been some big events already in this election cycle, obviously. How have you seen organizations pivot and respond in their messaging and actions? Kind of like what's working and what's not. You kind of talk about a lot of that post, like, hey, what if this happens and how to respond? But like, have you already seen some stuff kind of on the ground running, stuff that people have done without, you don't have to name any names, but things that you see that are kind of working there that you wish maybe orgs did more of potentially?
That's a really good question. I think sort of maybe not surprising based on what I just said, but I think, especially with the shooting, like, organizations who are sort of taking the time to be thoughtful in the response, kind of not like rushing in just to say something, but really making sure that they're thinking about, okay, what do our supporters want to hear from us specifically about? And then I feel like I have an example. This is not a nonprofit, but in the sort of like what not to do kind of thing, I know a lot of the internet was talking about Sticker Mule, which is a sticker company. And they had set out something that was after the shooting, and we're sort of basically saying, we support Trump. Like, I hope you all support Trump too. By the way, here's a discount on some t-shirts. And it was just kind of a strange message. And a lot of their customer base, I think, was surprised by that. And sort of all of a sudden, they've politicized their business in a way that it hadn't been before. Even though I think the intent behind their message was one of sort of like, let's all be unified kind of thing. So it can be very easy to get things wrong in these very heightened moments. So making sure that if you are reacting, it's thoughtful and it's based in kind of what you want to say and what your supporters are probably expecting you to say. And then I think also just as much as possible, people focusing on the longer term and sort of like the bigger picture of like, where are we going? It can also get really easy to get caught up on whatever piece of news is happening at the moment. And so to sort of keep an eye on, okay, what's at stake, with this election? Like, what does this mean about our future? And maybe not being quite as like rattled around by every little smaller development, and really focusing that message on like, here's what it means for us. Here's what it means for the causes that we care about.
The one other example that pops to mind that I've seen recently that I thought was helpful was a couple organizations responding to the news about J.D. Vance being named as the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party. I've seen some orgs pull out like kind of explainer style messaging of like, who is this senator? What about his record do you need to know that is relevant to that bigger picture question of, what is happening with climate change or inequality, and, what do we need to get out of this election? I think it is easy sometimes, as somebody who follows politics very closely and has worked in politics, to remember that the average American and global citizen just is not paying attention to this stuff on a day-to-day basis at all on the same level that I am. And so that kind of basic, let's take a step back and reset the stakes of what's happening here and kind of explain the news in the context of our organization's work. That style messaging can be really effective.
There's some really great points. From the sounds of it, just slowing down and taking that, capitalizing on moments when it's appropriate, but really slowing down and making sure you get it in a genuine and thoughtful way. It sounds like that's a good takeaway for everyone. We have tasked you both with this really intense experience here of trying to dive into the election again and put you on the spotlight there to kind of answer our questions. And I really appreciate everything that you guys have brought to the table here. It's a lot of invaluable information. So thank you so much for that. And the last question I'm going to ask is, when people get too tired of election related things and are looking to turn to other sources of just anything else, basically, other than the election, when it gets to be a little too much, what are you turning to? Is there a podcast? Is there a movie, TV series out there right now? Just looking for recommendations.
Yeah, so I'm emotionally about 80 years old, and I like to listen to baseball on the radio. For me, that is the most calming thing. It's sad that John Sterling has retired and no longer graces us Yankees fans with his presence, but still nice to spend a summer day listening to the ballgame.
I guess I comfort rewatch a lot of sitcoms. So Schitt's Creek, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, stuff that I already know what's going to happen, so I don't have to worry about unpredictable futures. And then the other thing is just doing some kind of fun activity. The thing that I have started this summer is water aerobics at my local kind of Parks and Rec aquatic centers. It's super fun, be outside, get some sunshine, splash around. So just finding whatever it is for you that sort of can help get out of the brain that might be racing a little bit, and then think about using some of your senses and connect in that way has been very, very helpful for me.
That's amazing. That's so good. Big props to going outside. That's big on my list, and the aerobics and everything, and also baseball listener as well, but not a Yankees fan. I'm sorry, Henry. Go Reds. Yeah, no, this has been amazing. And honestly, thank you both so much for being here and just kind of letting us kind of pepper you with these questions and going over so much important information. Thank you both for being here. And hopefully we have lots of time to rest in between all the craziness that's, happening. So, but thanks everyone for being here. And thank you, Beth and Henry.